that aeroplane riding she dared, her sweetheart began to think of a plan where they could be wed overhead. So he said, I will get an airship right away, a neat one to hold about two. Then, smiling with joy, she said to her boy, you're the captain and I am the crew.
Hi friends, my name is Molly June Roquet, and I'm excited to be presenting today. This is Critical Digital Literacy, empowering students to build a better world. I always find these slides a little awkward, but I also always appreciate understanding the perspective of presenters. So, a bit about me. I'm the head librarian at Redwood Day School, an independent K-8 school in Oakland, California. I'm fairly new to this position, but have previously worked in independent and public school libraries and as a public librarian. I really appreciate your time watching this, and I hope it's useful to you. I sort of miss the interactivity and dialogue that's just missing in this format. So please get in touch with any thoughts, disagreements, or perspectives that you'd like to share. My Twitter handle and my email are on this slide. I'm recording in mid-May, hello from the past, and I'm told that during ALA there will be an open house with presenters on Saturday, June 26th. Assuming that's still the plan, unfortunately, I need to attend a dear friend's baby shower at that same time, so please use any of these other avenues if you'd like to get in touch, and I hope to hear from you. So here's my plan for today. First, I'd like to talk about our current approaches to digital literacy, information literacy, and digital citizenship, and where I think they might fall short in preparing students for the real world that they're about to inherit, where the stakes involved in these domains are pretty dang high. Then I want to introduce the idea of criticality and give you some background on what I think goes into that. Finally, I'd like to share a few suggestions on how this might show up in your teaching. This isn't a prepackaged curricula or a set of exercises that are ready to go. Instead, I think criticality can be layered into any lesson or activity, and I hope you leave with some ideas of ways you might do that, or maybe even ways you already are. I think we should start just by reflecting on how quickly our understanding of the internet has changed. If you're around my age, 30, you may remember the internet sort of looking and feeling like the image on the left. We logged onto cyberspace on America Online or through Netscape on my 56K modem, and we surfed the web. It was a place we went to. The internet doesn't feel like that anymore, right? And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that it's everywhere. It's no longer a place we go to. It's a place we're in, that we're surrounded by. Increasing parts of our daily life are mediated through networked technology. Transportation, our jobs, our finances, our relationships, medicine, our interactions with the government. I bought a new tea kettle a few weeks ago, and I found myself looking at tea kettles with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. The hunger to turn everything into monetizable data just seems to be endless. The other reason I think that it feels so different now is that so many of the compounding crises we face as a country, as a world, are deeply intertwined with networked technology. On the right, you see a 2018 New York Times report on Facebook's major role in the Rohingya genocide in Burma. You might disagree with this, but in my mind, some of the biggest challenges facing our country include 1, climate change, 2, our inability to reckon honestly with history, recognize that white supremacy has always been and continues to be foundational to the United States, and make real change to become a multiracial democracy. And 3, the increasing income, opportunity, and resource gap between rich and poor. These 3 problems are deeply intertwined with each other. And many people would say they're essentially the same problem, capitalism run amok. But regardless of how you feel about them or how you frame them, I hope you agree that they're problems. Each has been exacerbated by and is deeply intertwined with network technology. Here are some examples of those connections. Social media companies have found profit in amplifying the most extreme anti-science and white supremacist voices, fueling racist violence, and providing material support to the slow-motion anti-democratic coup happening across the country, most notably during the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So-called artificial intelligence has given the state new tools to surveil and punish the poor. Blockchain cryptocurrencies and their attendant Bitcoin mining industry will soon use as much energy as Denmark. And between March and April, as millions died and billions suffered in a variety of ways from the COVID-19 pandemic, the world's billionaires added $1.62 trillion to their bank accounts, an overall increase of 55% from before the pandemic, driven largely by tech profits. These are big issues to think about, and if we want students to create a better world, we need to get them thinking about solutions to these problems. And specifically in our domain, how information and technology tools can be used to either exacerbate or ameliorate these problems. But I worry that some of our work is still designed for the internet you see on the left. I get dizzy trying to figure out whether Venn diagrams of information literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, and digital citizenship overlap and diverge. But I kind of want to put things in two boxes now, and I hope this makes sense. First, there's information literacy and digital literacy instruction, which tend to be skills-oriented. We teach kids how to do tasks at varying levels of complexity, from doing basic Google searches to synthesizing concepts for a research paper. Well, some of our work tends to speak to the wider world outside of school. I'm thinking of lessons on identifying misinformation online, for example. Most of this work is specifically designed to build skills required for college and career. While students may learn about something, in the process, that's usually secondary for us as librarians to them learning how to do something. The other kind of box is digital citizenship. Despite its civic, democracy-flavored name, I find digital citizenship curricula to be largely about regulating student behavior and avoiding what is perceived as bad behavior online, from violating copyright law to cyberbullying. Sometimes it reminds me of the sort of silly anti-drug and anti-smoking material I was shown as a child. Rarely are students asked to consider systems. For example, we tell students not to cyberbully each other, but we rarely ask why digital tools are often built to encourage cruel and antisocial behavior. The answer is profit. Instead, we focus on individual actions and individuals and try to police individual behavior. It's maybe not a coincidence that many existing digital citizenship curricula were either developed or funded with support from Silicon Valley companies. Neither of these approaches will really help students grapple with some of the larger problems around network technology, nor even really to understand the digital world that they're growing up in. I'm not suggesting we jettison all of this. Maybe some of it. But there's still obviously a need to teach students how to use technology and how to do research. However, I think without some deeper context, knowledge development, and real critical thinking, we're not serving our kids well, and we're not developing literacy for the real world. Our approach is off-target and incommensurate to the scale of the problem. So I find this model helpful, and I hope you will too. I'm by no means a philosopher, and honestly, I don't have enough background in critical theory to truly do it justice. But here's my layperson's understanding. Critical theory emerged out of Europe in the early 20th century. At its core is a commitment to improving human conditions and an understanding that social and cultural phenomena are often more complex and systemic than they appear on the surface. This leads to an emphasis on looking at systems, and especially at interrogating hidden assumptions and structures of oppression. You can contrast this with traditional theories, which often emphasize individual choices, and depending on the domain, often focus on describing reality, as in the case of science, replicating something that already exists, or controlling people or nature. Think about digital citizenship. My understanding is that this is best understood as a way to think about theories and approaches to knowledge, rather than as a unified theory with one school of thought. So feminism, critical race theory, and queer theory can all be understood to be critical theories. Within our field and its neighbors, there's critical librarianship, critical technology studies, and critical media studies. I'm also taking a lot of inspiration from academic librarians who have pioneered critical information literacy in that instructional context. What I'm sharing, hopefully with the appropriate level of humility, is not the approach to critical digital literacy, but an approach to what critical digital literacy might look like in a K-12 instructional context. Over the next 4 slides, I want to share 4 elements that we can use to expand any curriculum or area of study to include some level of criticality. These aren't concrete instructional strategies like think, pair, share, or concept mapping, but rather elements or even habits that can be incorporated in lots of ways, as long as we're intentional about doing it. A critical investigation of a technology or information topic could be an entire unit or activity, but criticality should also have a home in all sorts of other contexts, whether we're talking to students about communicating online or teaching them how to use a research database. So here's the first one, and it's going to sound simple. It's creating space for questions and critique. I know we would all like to think we do that, and in many ways, I'm sure we all probably do, but in specific contexts, books would be one example, and technology is often another. We often act as cheerleaders. I know I have, situating ourselves such that it's hard for students to be truly critical without taking a significant risk. I think creating that space is really important. And it doesn't mean we have to stop being excited about books or technology, but we can model being critical and asking questions even about things we love. This can mean surfacing and sharing our own genuine questions, and it can mean making space for student questions and discussing those without feeling like we need to immediately answer or resolve them. There are lots of types of questions. And of course, here we're less interested in clarifying or process questions and more interested in a particular type of questioning. I'm going to go into a little more depth on what I mean by that over the next few slides. Obviously, this is developmental too. Questions in a kindergarten class are going to be different than in a middle or high school. But I think even young kids can practice asking critical questions. What would you change about this? Is an easy question that anyone can grapple with about any sort of content, whether we're talking about a book, a company, or an app. It's also really important that we make space for students to bring their critical thinking without exerting too much control over the conversation or having a clear end goal in mind. Students will see this coming and they'll respond accordingly. But we do have a role to play in gently guiding the conversation toward deeper thinking. A great way to do that is to drop in new information as the conversation progresses that students can think through and revise their critical stance accordingly. I want to emphasize how important that stance is. Too often, teachers and especially librarians and ed tech folks act as salespeople or cheerleaders for the products they're bringing to schools. Regardless of how we feel about any of it, adopting a more humble position where we don't know everything, where we recognize and expect that anything, no matter how well-meaning or how cool-looking, will have flaws and oversights, will have a big impact on how students understand and approach technology and all the attendant issues that come with it. The first set of questions I want to introduce have to do with impact. One central part of this critical approach is recognizing that we need to look beyond the superficial when dealing with anything involving social structures. Again and again, governments and corporations and organizations say they are committed to equality and to equal opportunity, but measures of impact tell a different story. Think about how often you've heard that we live in a colorblind or post-racial society or a nation of equal opportunities. And then think about the disparities in wealth, housing, access to education and medicine, and so on. For this reason, a critical approach centers impact and seeks to contextualize any subject around the real benefits it provides or the real pain it inflicts on people, and particularly on people of different identities, BIPOC and queer communities who have been historically marginalized. So I want to share 4 questions that can be incorporated into your teaching to surface these issues. Depending on the timing and subject, these may be questions you ask your students or share with students, or have students research on their own. Who benefits from this? Who is negatively impacted? What are impacted groups saying about it? And finally, will this exacerbate existing inequalities? And if not, why not? Notice there's no presumption of equal outcomes here. Products or programs not specifically designed with equity in mind are doomed to recreate and reify the oppressive systems they operate within. Specifically with technologies, we can encourage students to consider impact by looking beyond the superficial, beyond what a company or service says about itself, to what people in impacted communities say, or what the data tells us. We should also remember to think intersectionally. People's experiences are not defined by one identity, and for people who live at the intersection of multiple identities that have been marginalized in society, the impacts of technologies that punish, exclude, or ill-serve the less socially privileged in our society can be particularly awful. Depending on the topic, students may need some scaffolding to help them understand, especially the impact of technology. It really depends. They may have firsthand experience from their own lives and communities, or this may be an opportunity to build some perspective and empathy. When I talk about impact, that can mean very real human and social needs. Access to education, healthcare, democracy, or government services, but also psychological harm and trauma. Sometimes the technology doesn't just limit access, but is itself inaccessible. We've heard so many stories when the implementation of network technology, purported to make things easier and more efficient, has instead blocked access for disabled users. Third, I want to emphasize context. By context, I mean learning about something by learning about everything that surrounds it. What came before, how it came about, the people involved, the ideas or debates, and finally, really trying to situate a subject in a variety of ways, through different social, economic, or political aspects, theories, or ways of thinking. Context-seeking questions include things like, who made this? Why? What's their story? As an example here, does it matter that Facebook originated with a 19-year-old Mark Zuckerberg building a website to compare the attractiveness of his female classmates? I would argue that yes, it tells us something sort of important about Facebook. Who's using this? Who's contributing to it and who isn't? How is it paid for? Who's paying for it? It's so important that students understand the business models of the programs and services they're interacting with, especially the ones that appear on the surface to be free. How is it used? What have other people done with it? What are people saying about it? And finally, how does it interact with or impact other social issues or problems? Seeking context is a habit that we can build. And I want to emphasize the Jenny Odell quote at the bottom of this slide from her wonderful book, Doing Nothing. Odell writes, "Given that all of the issues that face us demand an understanding of complexity, interrelationship, and nuance, the ability to seek and understand context is nothing less than a collective survival skill." In the book, Odell argues that one of the main challenges around algorithm and profit-driven social media feeds is that they present tiny pieces of information in rapid succession in a way that really discourages critical thinking and context seeking. To me, context is the core of criticality. Instead of taking anything at face value, criticality is that habit of asking questions, of looking for surrounding information that might explain what's really happening and how we can understand any tool, idea, or phenomenon within wider social systems. I think of context seeking as a sort of applied curiosity, a habit of recognizing that any subject or any topic has to be understood within the wider, sometimes invisible social systems that we're all operating within. So we've talked about creating a culture of questioning, about the importance of looking at impact, and about the habit of seeking context. And finally, I would like to talk about one more element that I think is essential for a critical lens, and that's the skill of imagining alternatives. I'm borrowing here from abolitionist thinkers who are working to reimagine public safety, like the brilliant Mariame Kaba, who's quoted below with Kelly Hayes. Writing about police and prison abolition, they write, "We live in a society that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. It's time to look hard at how this system came to be, who profits, how it functions, and why." As writer and educator Erica Miners suggests, liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design. It's time for a jailbreak of the imagination in order to make the impossible possible. Maybe the core idea of criticality is recognizing that whatever exists currently was never inevitable, and certainly isn't inevitable in the future. Whatever you think of abolishing police or prisons, that practice of imagining alternatives is incredibly powerful. It not only helps us to imagine a better future and think through other possibilities, but it can also illuminate aspects of present conditions that can otherwise be overlooked. I think this is especially true and important in regards to technology. As a society, we tend to think of new technologies as retroactively having been inevitable, and to confuse the technology itself with all of the economic and social context that surrounds it. For example, the information collected and organized by Google, from search results to traffic information to flights to Google Books, can be incredibly useful. But there's no reason that those projects had to be funded through invasive tracking and advertising. What would it look like if they were government funded? What would it look like as a subscription model? On a larger scale, what if more technology research was funded for medical or humanistic purposes, instead of emerging, like the internet or GPS or duct tape, for military uses? As with other elements I've introduced, part of our job here as teachers is to get out of the way and invite students into these discussions without having a clear endpoint in mind. Questions that can surface this type of thinking include, what else could this look like? What would you change about this? What problem does this solve? What other idea would solve the same problem? What else would need to change to make this different or better? And how else could this be funded or supported or organized? So we've been floating around in sort of abstract concepts. Thank you for bearing with me. Now I want to get a little more concrete and share some ways this can show up in the classroom. A quick caveat before that. I'm not here to give you a ready-to-go critical digital literacy curriculum. And frankly, I would be suspicious of anyone who says they are. Criticality can and should be layered into anything we're doing. So some of this may not be so much rethinking whole lessons or whole units, but moving some stuff around to make space for critical discussions while covering the material we need to cover. I'd love for you to be thinking about your own teaching and of some places you might want to experiment with adding in a critical lens, or places you might already be. Many of our roles include teaching technology. That might be library-specific technology, like using the catalog or a research database or hardware in a makerspace, or that might be part of a larger school-wide digital literacy initiative, where you're teaching email or digital production or anything else. As I mentioned earlier, I've sometimes found myself adopting a sort of cheerleader approach, where I'm trying to impress the students with what the tools can do. And while excitement is good, anytime we're teaching technology, I think it's important that we add a critical lens and invite students to ask some hard questions. So one way we can do that is by making the curricular purpose of a tool, website, app, subscription, whatever it is, clear. Here's why we purchased this or why we're using this and what we expect you to do with it, without going into salesperson mode. Second is creating space for student opinions. And that might start with really just the baseline, what do you like or dislike about it? I don't like the design. I don't like how the interface is set up. But kind of pushing them toward more critical thinking about impact, context, and alternatives. You can do that by inviting students to consider, think about, research context or alternatives, to imagine alternatives and what those might look like. You can model criticality and sort of create this space by sharing your own thoughts and your own hesitations or your own excitements. Maybe tell students how the decision was made to use this particular piece of technology in school. And finally, I think anytime you're talking about tools that collect student data in any way, it's important to make space for conversations about that. I know that can feel tricky as a teacher because we don't always have a say over what technology we're using or how data is being collected or monetized by third-party companies. We can't tell students not to use required technology, and that can put us in an awkward spot when we're talking about data privacy and students are realizing there's reasons they might not want to use a piece of technology. But it's so important to have the conversation, whether or not students really have a choice. And it's particularly important for students to have space to share how they feel about their data being collected and monetized, whether that's within your classroom or within the library, or by allowing them to communicate in some way directly to your technology folks or your administration. Discussions of representation and media literacy are often inherently critical, but I want to expand this work and use media, whether it's academic or sort of popular media, to introduce social justice issues in ways that are comprehensible to young learners. Additionally, I think a critical approach can help bridge the gap between academic information literacy, which is often very focused on college level and career research skills, and information and media literacy in our own everyday lives, where the stakes and context are quite different. One idea I have around this is rethinking the way we teach source assessment. I've noticed that kids often arrive in the library with a very binary view of sources, specifically for school projects. There are good sources and there are bad sources. And while this is sort of intuitive for academic research, it's a very oversimplified way of thinking about sources and reliability, and it has very little relationship to the way we assess media in our own personal lives, where good and bad are much more subjective and contextual. A critical approach can start from the premise that all sources are flawed and reflect human biases, and focus on understanding the context around a source, rather than taking any source at face value. One existing strategy around this is lateral fact-checking. If you're not familiar with this, the idea is that instead of looking at surface-level aspects of a source, like reading the about page, considering the number of ads, or reading about the author, the kind of things that are suggested in the CRAP test, for example, a better strategy is often to get outside of the source and use other trusted sources to triangulate and figure out its reliability. In the Stanford study that originated this approach, students, professors, and professional fact-checkers were asked to assess multiple websites, including that of an anti-gay hate group. Students and professors largely did what they had learned from librarians. They read the about page, they looked at the design, they thought about the surface-level markers of reliability. And largely, they fell for the bad source. The professional fact-checkers largely did what librarians would actually do. They opened a secondary tab, they searched for the organization, they read one or two pages from Wikipedia, one or two sentences rather from Wikipedia, and were immediately able to identify what kind of source it was. What I love about this approach, in addition to the fact that it actually works, is that it's not just for academic work. It really speaks to how we use the internet in our low-stakes personal lives as well, where a lot of information is coming from social media or other sources that are a little hard to assess with traditional approaches. I've included here a variety of other questions that we've talked about that can be applied to media and information literacy work, whether we're looking at a particular publication or article, thinking about a research database or tool, or asking students to reflect on their own research practice at the close of a project. So I've presented on these topics a few times, and I often get some sort of pushback along the lines of, sure, this stuff is obviously important, but right now I'm focused on the basics. I'm trying to just teach basic tech skills or to get my kids to stop bullying each other on social media. And now you're saying I need to get into these big, complicated subjects. Shouldn't that happen when they're older and more ready for these topics? It's a really fair critique, especially in the context of the limited time and resources and even access to instructional time with students that librarians have. But I keep coming back to this. Our students are already interacting with the grossest parts of the internet. They're already being tracked and surveilled and influenced. And this is happening not only because of individual choices they've made, but often because of choices they have no control over. The photos their parents have been posting of them since literally the day they were born, the online activity that's required to complete school assignments, and even the actual software from Google to Zoom that we're now often using to do school. So I do think we have a responsibility to give students some basic critical literacy around these systems, which are already having a big impact on their lives. I would also argue that even young students can understand these concepts. I taught a big data unit to 6th graders. We started by investigating the concept and just sort of understanding what big data was, how it was different than data, and why it was so powerful, through really understandable everyday examples like Google Traffic or Netflix's recommendations engine. Then we dug into some of the controversies and social aspects of big data, from advertising to privacy to disparate outcomes for people of color in a variety of contexts. I would argue that this sort of curricula should be at the core of anything we're calling digital citizenship. Instead, we're presenting ideas like the digital footprint, the idea that students should not only avoid embarrassing content about themselves online, but actively curate positive information about themselves. This concept sounds like it came straight out of a Facebook marketing meeting, and it may well have. To teach this without helping students understand why all this data is out there and what others are doing with it and what the profit motive and the business model is around it is a disservice to them and to the future society we're going to have, which will need to grapple with these issues and find some solutions rather to the problems we're facing. So I want to speak a little more on digital citizenship and share some ideas about what critical digital citizenship might look like. I remember loving government class in high school. We learned about the structures and systems within the government, about how courts work, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about how things have changed over time as a result of activism and agitation. I think civics education is so important, and its decline over the past few decades has had obvious impacts on our society. But we also need a new sort of civics that addresses the ways network technology is reworking our civic society and infrastructure. Digital citizenship could be this, should be this, but we need to rework our approach away from managing student behaviors and telling them what to do or what not to do, and toward helping them understand systems and change. By systems, I mean everything we've talked about already: economics, the impact of things, and the relationship of technology and information to systemic racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry and exclusion. Focusing on change gets us away from the technological determinism or technological inevitability that I talked about a few slides ago. Students should explore and consider how things change and look at real-world examples of when this has happened in history. There are wonderful examples of each of these, from Google employees organizing to oppose collaboration with the Chinese government, to the activism against Facebook's real name policy from transgender and indigenous users and drag performers, to the political and economic battles over file sharing and media consumption. As students explore these issues and understand how they impacted the current technology landscape, They're also developing their own political identity and understanding themselves as having agency in their relationships with technology. And that's real civics. So were this session to be in person, my plan was to make you think of a lesson, activity, unit, or subject that you cover in your instruction. Then ask you to think of ways you could add or expand a critical lens as part of that study. If you think that might be a useful next step, I'd encourage you to take some time and start planning. As you think about your own curriculum, consider the 4 elements I shared that can create space for criticality. Creating a culture of questioning and critique, looking beyond the superficial to investigate impact on particular groups, developing a habit of looking for context, and imagining alternatives to the present state. Finally, remember that a critical approach is not just about instruction, and it's not just for students. Applying these same strategies, making space for questions, considering impact, seeking context, and imagining alternatives also can have a home in everything we do, from collection development to collaborating with teachers to our work on committees or in leadership. Criticality is a habit for adults just as it is for kids and just as badly needed in creating the space and comfort with discomfort necessary to do the work is really important for dismantling library and school practices that reify oppression and exclusion. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I'll leave my contact information up in case you'd like to get in touch. Thanks.
Up, up with ethereal way up to the sky. Sail around the moon for a quiet boom just to pass the new and I. Let us float, float, float through the clouds and just have a lot of fun. We'll go up, up, up as 2 and then come down as 1. Take me up along with you, me darling, do, and let us go away into a latitude about as near as anybody that has ever reached the sky. We can sail around the lunar planet, making love and hugging every time we scan it, with nobody in the aeroplane except the parts you and I. We could float a little, flying boat a little, while we wrote a little, sent it note a little, subsequent to passing through the clouds and having lots of fun. We'll go up into the sweetest sky of blue, and on ascending we will figure up as 2, but on returning to old terra firma we will be as 1.